Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Townsend Center. Um, I'm Stephen Best, the director of the Townsend Center, professor in the Department of English. We're delighted to host Andreja Novakovic of the Philosophy Department to discuss her book, Chantal Akerman, Filmmaker and Philosopher. In conversation today with Andreja is Miryam Sass, professor of the Departments of Comparative Literature and Film and Media. Chair of Film and Media?
Yes.
Yes, and chair of Film and Media. So we'll be sponsoring two more events before spring break. Um, Tomorrow, Zahid Chowdhury of the Princeton Department of English will be here to discuss his recent book, Paranoid Publics, Psychopolitics of Truth. And Chowdhury's visit is sponsored by the Critical Theory Commons, a year-long collective inquiry into the present and future role of critical theory. And our next book chat happens on Wednesday, March 18th, when Sarah Gold McBride, a lecturer in history in the American Studies program, will be here to discuss her publication, Whiskerology, The Culture of Hair in 19th Century America. Sarah will be in conversation with David Henkin, a friend of the Townsend Center and professor in the Department of History. Okay, I leave it to you, Andrea and Miryam.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you so much, Andrea, for giving me this opportunity to discuss your exciting new book, Chantal Akerman, Filmmaker and Philosopher. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to think together with Chantal Akerman's films, as your book allows us to do, opening up surprisingly accessible analyses centered around four topics, four chapters: home, work, love, and desire. Your book also allows us to think with other key aspects of Akerman's work, avowed or disavowed by her, including feminist critique, queer and lesbian thought, temporality, relationships with the everyday, cinematic genre, and most centrally, how long-standing philosophical questions resonate in her work. You draw on a long history of both formal and informal critique of Akerman's work, including everything from academic books to podcasts to off-the-cuff remarks she made in televised interviews, and including, of course, the many meta-reflections on her work inherent in the films themselves. So your interlocutors here at times suggested by allusions in the films range from Lacan to Cavell, Deleuze to Anne Carson, Walter Benjamin to Simone Weil, to Simone de Beauvoir, Rita Felski, to Mariana Ortega and beyond. Of course, with well-placed allusions to a central area of your own research and your own prior books, Hegel. So my remarks here today will focus on some of the moments where you allow Akerman's films to illuminate and be illuminated by these thinkers. And I'm going to use your words as much as possible, allowing the book to speak for itself. In the book, similarly, you highlight the receptivity of Akerman's method and mode of filmmaking, tracking what you call her use of images between images, images that might not otherwise be valorized on film, and images of activities like housework that are also devalued or made invisible in the world. Speaking about the film Dest, I don't know, how many of you have seen like at least 3 Akerman films? Most of you. Okay. How many have seen one? Okay, good. All right. Well, anyway, Dest is a film about Eastern Europe, and you write about it in your chapter on home, and you quote Akerman describing her receptive method. She says, "I will not attempt to show the disintegration of a system, nor the difficulties of entering into another one, because she who seeks shall find all too well, and end up clouding her vision with her own preconceptions." Similarly, you write about Heidegger's conception of moods, which resonates very strongly with theories of affect in the humanities, even as you also call into doubt the direct relevance of writing about Heidegger together with Akerman. And you show its relevance in thinking something like the learning made possible by attending not to one's own preconceptions or expectations of what one will find. So this is like a quote from the book. There's one aspect, but it starts with but, because, do we use Heidegger or not is itself a question here. But there's one aspect of Heidegger's notion of being in the world that is useful for clarifying Akerman's approach in her documentaries. Heidegger's conception of moods can help us see why it would be a mistake to assume that Akerman is either documenting reality or documenting her own consciousness. For one, Heidegger holds that moods permeate our being in the world even when we do not notice them. For another, Heidegger claims that a mood comes neither from outside nor inside, but arises out of being in the world. Just like meaning is not projected onto an otherwise meaningless world, so moods do not color an otherwise moodless world. Instead, moods open up the world, disclosing it as the meaningful context that it is. Heidegger is especially interested in the mood of anxiety, which he thinks has the power to reveal that the human being is always also homeless or unheimlich. So that kind of receptivity, that it's neither describing something that's definitely outside, nor depicting one's interior moods in a kind of mimetic mode of that interior, but something kind of neither one nor the other, was really interesting to me. And you draw this into relation with Mariana Ortega's In Between, when Ortega writes how, quote, multiplicitous selves in the margins are constantly experiencing disruptions in their everyday being in worlds, or instances of what I describe as not being at ease, and instances of what Ortega describes as not being at ease. And she, in turn, draws on Gloria Andaluza's Borderlands, La Frontera, in a discussion of inhabiting a borderland, a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. So there's many kinds of boundaries in this book around gender, sexuality, labor, home and exile, historical memory, emotional genre categories, and cinematic structures that Akerman's work disrupts and also brings into perceptibility. And your own work actually exists in a sort of a border zone between film criticism, philosophy, and something else that I'm not sure how to define. And you model a receptivity to Akerman's work and draw out your own voice and thoughts in a way that is really accessible to any reader, whether or not they're academically oriented or not, whether or not they've actually ever seen an Akerman film or not. This book is very enjoyable to read, very smooth, smoothly narrated. So perhaps you could comment on your own methodology, like how you arrived at it, how you arrived at the style of this work. It has its own very distinct style that's not Akerman's style, it's your narrative style. And what modes of reflection or receptivity conditioned your understanding and exploration of the work? Did you kind of channel that kind of receptivity that she describes in her own work in order to approach it? And in the book, you also talk a lot about pleasure, the pleasure of certain kinds of labors, but also the labor's repetitions, erasures, the kind of futility in a way, never arriving at a known goal. So I wonder if I could ask what were the pleasures and also the frustrations potentially of working on Akerman. So it's kind of like a bundle of questions that you can approach however, whatever works for you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Miryam, for agreeing to be my interlocutor and for these rich questions. Maybe the first thing I'll say is that one thing that Akerman very often said about herself is that she never felt at home in the world. So one documentary that's made about Akerman has the title, I Don't Belong Anywhere. So this was the kind of pervasive self-understanding that she brought to all of her work. And maybe it's also the thing that kind of drew me to her in the end. So initially, when I was thinking about the project, I really was thinking that home or homelessness would be the kind of overarching theme of the work. But then I ended up noticing all these other themes that were more tangentially related to that of the concept of home. And so it ended up expanding beyond that. It was a real challenge for me to write this book, partly because I didn't really have very many models for how to do it. And I think this sort of speaks to the question you're asking me about how I developed my method for doing this. So it was supposed to be a kind of philosophical engagement with Akerman, but there is a tendency among philosophers who write about film that they write about film in a way that isn't very sensitive to the medium, and that doesn't engage with a lot of film scholarship, but that also writes about these films as if they could have been really presented in any other form, as if it could have as well been a short story or a theatrical performance. And I was trying to resist this as much as I could, but of course I come from a philosophical background, and so I don't have the training to really write about this kind of medium. And so I was trying to, in some ways, teach myself how to do this by engaging with film scholarship. But that made this work kind of hybrid of a bunch of different influences rather than something that's modeling itself on one particular way of doing it. Even though I do want to say that Cavell was a recurring inspiration for me, because he is somebody who writes philosophically about film in a way that I found very inspiring. So I think one of the main forms of labor, and maybe the most challenging form of labor in writing about Akerman, was watching her films over and over again. So I was trying very hard to nail the descriptions. And this was, in fact, one of the biggest challenges in writing about her, because I'm not used to writing about something visual. But I also was trying very hard to be as precise as I could in describing these scenes. And so in order to do that, I was just watching them over and over again and making sure that I'm getting the order of events and the like subtle shifts in each scene down. And so I think that was the most labor-intensive part of writing this book. And that also allowed me then to give these readings of the scenes. So I think one of the ways in which I was trying to resist writing about Akerman as if it was in any other form was by trying to give very precise readings of specific scenes in her films and trying to anchor what I was saying about her in my reading of these scenes. And that was the more labor-intensive part of the work, but also a source of satisfaction for sure, a source of pleasure for sure. I think the frustration for me, or maybe one of the challenges I faced in writing it, is that I didn't want to rely too heavily on what Akerman herself says. She says fascinating things about her own work in interviews, and it was hard to resist including many of these statements. But I didn't want to treat her, first of all, as the ultimate authority on her own films, but then also rely too much on what is verbally expressed. And also maybe treat her films as if they were expressions of some position that Akerman expressed in an interview, articulated in an interview or in a piece of writing. And so one thing that I found really difficult is how to incorporate her as an interlocutor with all of these philosophical writers that I was including in the book without sort of reducing her work to a set of statements or relying too heavily on what she said about her own films rather than the films themselves. So I think that was one of the major challenges I faced in writing it. I don't know if I would say it was a source of frustration, but it was certainly something that was unlike the challenges I'd faced in the past.
Yeah, definitely the home and exile kind of dialectic is felt throughout, even though the first chapter is on the topic of home and also sort of non-home. It winds up pervading all the other chapters about everything, ways of being at home or not at home in the genre of romance, or home or not at home in genre, home or not at home in sexuality, winds up being there. So was there anything that like really surprised you, like in that image of like she goes into Dest, but not with her own ideas of what it should be? Was there anything where, like in the process of writing this book, something changed in you?
Well,
your relation to Akerman or something?
I would say quite a bit, but I think a lot of it also has to do with the personal nature of writing about films like this. So it made me reflect a lot on the autobiographical or personal nature of any academic writing, because it was so much harder to evade in this context. Like the themes I was drawn to, the things I noticed in her films were very personal. And I think that in that way, I actually feel like I was kind of modeling her own engagement with whatever it is that she writes about, because she's always bringing her personal history, her moods, whatever it is that she's going through at the moment to bear on what she films. And so in that sense, I felt like I was modeling that or experiencing a version of that in writing about her. But it did make me reflect on how maybe all academic writing is self-disclosing in some way or another, maybe a little bit less directly than in this case. I think the thing that surprised me, or the thing that I was trying to bring out, is something that her cinematographer, Babette Mangold, said about her, and I mentioned it in the very first paragraph, that it's very easy to see Akerman as very grim and dark, but that she was also funny and free. And so I think this is something that I kept noticing again and again, like her sense of humor, even in films that on the face of it don't appear to be humorous. And so I think that was something that kept surprising me and that I was trying very hard to bring out. And also her sense of irreverence, which is sort of connected to the theme of freedom, which I know you'll come back to in a bit.
Yeah, irreverence and being funny and being ironic. And yeah, the relation that many of us probably have to Akerman is very kind of personal. Like we're kind of Akerman nerds together, and that kind of brings us together in an interesting way. But also she's so interested in the impersonal or the detached or the external or something and you manage to kind of traverse both of those in your book in interesting ways.
Yeah, maybe two things to say about that. So one of the things that I was trying to resist that I noticed in some people's writing about Akerman is that they seem to think that she's not interested in the inner life or in subjectivity because there's something impersonal about her films. Like there's something impersonal about her way of filming the scenes that she does, but there's also a kind of impersonal quality in the characters that she films. Like they don't say very much, they don't disclose very much about themselves. And so they almost seem like to have no subjectivity or to lead no inner life or to have nothing sort of idiosyncratic. And so I was trying to...
Traditional ways that we're used to kind of understanding the emotions of a character on film, are not, those expectations are not fulfilled or are détourné, like switched out indifferently.
Yeah, exactly. So she's definitely sort of thwarting certain expectations for how subjectivity will be.
That's the word.
How it will be expressed. But I thought she was completely preoccupied with subjectivity. So to me, the films are very much about what it is to be a subject and to lead an inner life, both in the way that she films, because it's so personal. I mean, I think there is, even when she's sort of using tracking shots or filming in a way that seems to be disconnected from her own body, I still think it's supposed to be capturing her mood, the mood that she's in when she's filming. And so in that way, it is very much about her personal engagement or relation.
Right, a kind of more ambient question of mood, like you brought up before.
But I also think that the characters themselves lead sort of inner lives that fascinated Akerman. And so I think that even when she's resisting disclosing very much about them, their interiorities is very, very central to what she notices about them.
Thank you. Okay, at the end of the book, you write about the dialectic of freedom and captivity. In your analysis of dialectical movement, you argue that rather than holding the two poles of a binary opposition apart, that it makes more sense. This is kind of an overarching line in the book, kind of dealing with these binary oppositions, that it makes sense to consider their mutual entailment, their inseparability, their imbrication one in the other, for example, in the binary of home and exile that we just talked about, or interiority and exteriority that we were just mentioning. This aspect of your book resonates with your studies of Hegel in ways that I am also going to ask about. But at the end of the book, you write, quote, like Akerman herself, Ariane in La Captive, which is kind of a adaptation of Proust's section of book, Ariane does not have to stay stuck inside her own room, inside her own mind. Thankfully, there are friends for singing songs, making films, or talking philosophy. And you draw out the paradoxes in Akerman's work, for example, in the discussion of her crazy version of the romantic comedy called A Couch in New York, which probably most of you haven't seen. You remind us how one of the characters speaking for a woman friend paraphrases a famous quote by Lacan, that loving is giving something you don't have to someone who does not want it. And you note that as soon as she says it, it starts pouring and the two women are drenched in rain. So the tactility and visual pleasures of Akerman's films sometimes work as a counterpoint to the darker or more destabilizing or existentially stressful aspects of her work. It's many impossibilities, impasses, and derailing of the passages of desire, love, or connection. And at one point you bring up a quotation from Goethe's Elected Affinities, quote, this is a quote from Goethe, so all in their different fashions pursued their daily lives, thoughtfully or not, Everything seemed to be following its usual course, as is the way in monstrously strange circumstances when everything is at stake. We go on with our lives as though nothing were the matter. In our world today, this observation seems all the more pressing. So perhaps you could talk with us about two things. One is about this kind of hint that Akerman offers in various ways towards something like freedom or optimism or possibility, even in the face of captivity and emptiness, and her highlighting of how we are not at ease, these monstrously strange circumstances. And then second of all, could you elaborate how Hegel resonated for you in this book? Because we mentioned the personal connection to one's own academic work, and Andreja has another short book about Hegel and the family, which is another kind of way of taking Hegel in a direction that's not usually taken, in addition to another longer book about Hegel. So how that resonated and how you chose to use Hegel. And you mention explicitly in the book that you actually chose to sort of suppress or elide many other Hegelian ideas that you could have talked about. So what were some of those aspects that you elided in the interest of foregrounding Akerman more fully in the book?
Great. Thank you. So maybe just quickly about the last line that you quote. One of the things that I was trying to bring out in the book without mentioning it so explicitly is the importance of collaboration. So Akerman herself described herself as quite an individualist. She often said, I'm not a woman filmmaker, I'm not making women's films, I'm making Chantal Akerman's films, and she's often described as an auteur. But I was trying to emphasize her reliance on collaboration and her awareness of the extent to which she depended on these longstanding collaborators in getting her work done. And so the importance of the sort of social connection and social context in engaging in any creative or desirous pursuits. And so that's something that I was trying to sort of bring out, and one of the reasons I mentioned it at the end. And it's sort of connected to the theme of freedom, because for me, Akerman exhibits freedom through her irreverence. And so that's another sort of running theme in the work, that it's interested in what it is to live a free life, or how to surpass these many constraints or borders or barriers that you encounter. But I think she's also exhibiting that in the way that she's making her films, because she's showing it through a certain irreverent way of engaging with these traditional forms and genres. So Hegel, this is supposed to be my escape from Hegel. So that which is
can't escape captivity.
Which is part of the reason. So I mentioned him in the beginning when I'm trying to describe how I came to Akerman, or what it was about Akerman that struck me when I first watched her. And I watched her for the first time when I was in graduate school, when I was working on my dissertation. So Hegel is part of that story, but I didn't want to rely on him too much in my interpretation of her films. So one thing, so I mentioned him in the beginning, and I say this is the last time I will mention Hegel. And in fact, his name does not reappear in the book. So,
that's true.
But I think one way
he haunts from kind of underneath a little bit.
Yeah, he kind of haunts. And I was about to say that, because I think one of the ways in which I describe Hegel in the introduction is that he's a great foe of oppositional thinking, and that Akerman's own relationship to oppositions, like exile and home, or captivity and freedom, or inside and outside, which is the more pervasive one, that her own relationship to it is similar to Hegel's in some ways, because she doesn't fully abandon them, but she doesn't embrace them either. So she has this very complicated relationship to these binaries. And I think it's similar to Hegel's in some respects. And so that is, I think, the way in which Hegel kind of haunts the book, because I think, because I keep coming back to her complicated relationship to these oppositions, like this is the kind of Hegelian theme that I think pervades it. And maybe also in my reading of Jeanne Dielman. So, Jeanne Dielman is engaging in these kinds of monotonous habitual behaviors, and Hegel himself had a kind of ambivalent attitude towards habit, where he wasn't fully dismissive of it, but he saw that it contained certain dangers. And I think maybe in my reading of that particular film, these Hegelian themes also come to the fore, but I tried not to dwell on that.
Yeah, habit and tools and the everyday definitely come up a lot. So that's really interesting. Thank you. All right, so things have changed a lot in approaches, speaking of borderlands, and approaches to queer sexuality and gender forms since the 1970s. when Akerman made Je tu, il, elle, I, you, he, she. You write, so I'm going to use a long quote from you. You write, we already know that Akerman had her doubts about heterosexual romance, but do these extend to lesbian romance as well? So maybe that has to do with like the oppositional, like it's the ambivalence that you're talking about, that there's never a like, yay, this is the answer moment. In the context of Je tu, il, elle, you write, Akerman had ample reasons to avoid the romance plot she pursued in her later genre films. Two women who desire each other in 1974 would have faced many social and political obstacles to forming a couple. But Akerman does not turn her attention to what stands externally in their way. The one obstacle that does interest her is the dominance of the romance plot itself. And you say, I noticed that during the sex scene in Je tu, il, elle, the two women are watched by two dolls, one male and the other female, pinned to the wall above the bed. Perhaps, which I actually didn't notice that. Perhaps, maybe, I don't know, the first time I watched Je tu, il, elle, it was like on a really bad VHS tape in, you know, the 80s. And so you really couldn't see much, but it was quite amazing even like that. It was a college class with Alice Jardine. Okay, anyway, perhaps these two dolls are supposed to serve as a reminder of the paradigm of romantic love outside this bedroom. This would make them part of the background that, as Sarah Ahmed puts it, is to direct our desires away from queer objects onto straight lines. An interviewer once remarked to Akerman that the encounter between the two women in Je tu, il, elle seems violent. Akerman responded by pointing out that people expect there to be a scene justifying attraction between women, whereas in the case of a man and a woman, this question would not even arise. But in that same interview, Akerman also makes the highly general statement that love is violent. Her focus on what unfolds in the space between two people, her focus is on what unfolds in the space between two people, irrespective of gender. Even in her exploration of queer desire, Akerman continues to point toward an internal dynamic that tends to unsettle, sometimes even destroy interpersonal connection. So the presence, that's the end of the quote. The presence of love and marriage plots which devolve into evocative fragments in Toute une nuit, a film about kind of all night, nonetheless reassert themselves either ironically, citationally, or in many other forms in many of her films, alongside or in a skewed relationship with frequently triangulated notions of desire and its structures. So I wondered if you could draw out some of how Akerman resonates with and how your book extends ideas and theories of queerness, misfit sexualities, or even misfit subjectivities today, either standing upon resonant and unexpected border zones or between and among existing identities and points of view.
Okay, great, thank you. So one thing that Akerman said about herself is that she always felt that the more particular she is, the more she speaks to the general. And so I do think that she was always interested in what her own position or her own experience allows us to illuminate about the human condition or some feature of, some general feature of people's lives. And I think that's also true in the case of her engagement with queer sexuality, which is one of the reasons that she resisted being categorized too narrowly in that way. So she very often refused to allow her films, and especially Je tu, il, elle, to be screened at queer film festivals, and people kept asking her about this, and she would get very impatient. And she would sort of insist, like, no, this is just a love story. Like, why do you want to screen it in this context? And so I think that's part of what's in the background here, is that she does feel that when she's bringing her own personal experience to bear on a subject matter, it really is supposed to illuminate something universal, and everybody should feel addressed by it, and everybody should be able to recognize themselves in it. And so I think that's part of what's in the background there for her. But I was thinking, so I did bring some more contemporary writers into the picture when I was talking about her work on queer sexuality in particular. And like one figure that was kind of illuminating to me was Constance Debray. So Constance Debray is a contemporary author who has written a number of sort of autofictional novels. And when she talks about her experience of coming out or her experience of changing her sexual orientation, she describes it in ways that really resonate with Akerman. because of Akerman's own hesitation around identity and refusal to see it as a process of self-discovery or discovery of something that was already there to begin with. So I think that will be sort of one maybe contemporary interlocutor for her, who picks up, I think, a strand that was there in Akerman. But of course, I think there will be many others who would go against Akerman's own insistence on indeterminacy and fluidity and transformation.
I like that, indeterminacy. Yeah, and we have many people in the audience that can also perhaps elaborate on this and how, for you guys, Akerman does or doesn't resonate with some of these questions that are central to theories of gender, sexuality, queerness, race also, that are happening. Great, thank you. Okay, so anyway, this book was a pleasure to read and such a joy to get to know your work and your thinking. So thank you so much, Andreja, for sharing this generous re-engagement with Akerman with us and with your readers, and we will open to questions. Damon.
Oh, thank you so much for talking about the book, which I haven't had a chance to read yet. I was just hoping you could continue in the vein that you were just going in the last answer and explain, in your conception, Miryam mentioned the 4 chapters, what the difference is between love and desire in the way that you've separated them out there in relation to her films.
Great, thank you so much. So the chapter on love is really about her engagement with genre. So Akerman made, well, 2, I think, very straightforward genre films. So she made a musical and a romantic comedy. And so in framing that chapter as an investigation of love, what I was really interested in is the way that she deals with these conventions that are associated with these genres. And that, of course, then bled into the way that she deals with conventions associated with our romantic lives, or the kind of conformism that's people feel under pressure to submit to in their romantic lives. So it was about scripts on a number of different levels. And so that's part of the reason that I framed it in this way. But also these were films that dealt very explicitly with these themes about love and the couple, very explicitly. And so I think that's also why it made sense to group them together and to see them as connected to this question of love. But I do think that in some ways, Akerman's own position on some of these questions that the genre films themselves raise, that position really emerges in a different set of films, which I talk about in the last chapter, and that chapter is on desire. And I see those films as more like road movies. So I actually categorize them as sort of her take on the road movie, because people are sort of on a journey. It doesn't seem like it has a very clear end. So one example is Meetings with Anna, which is a film where a woman is sort of, yeah, it's the picture.
The picture on the cover is from Meetings with Anna.
Exactly. So it's a movie she made shortly after Jeanne Dielman. It's a very personal work. It's about a filmmaker who's kind of traveling through Europe to various screenings of her films, and she meets people along the way. It's also a film that deals with queer desire, but it also has a very different structure. It has a structure of a travel film or a road movie in some sense. I mean, she's traveling by train. And so I was suggesting that that's in some ways a counterpoint to some of these more conventional films that she was making when she was trying very hard to fit herself into these genres, like the romantic comedy or the musical form.
Yeah, so kind of love gets to be, like you allude to Arlie Hochschild, like the managed heart, like the bride who this is supposed to be the best day of their life and they're actually secretly bummed and stuff is going wrong. So they kind of pull themselves together and get into the right mode for enjoying the day, as opposed to like desire, which is in the desire section, the desire is often thwarted. It's often, there's always distance, and like this picture of Anna Aurore Clément, you know, she's calling, you describe this, how she's calling like a distant lover who's kind of not answering. There's always a kind of, I won't tell you the ending, but you know it anyway, but like the, you know, so the kind of like longing is present in desire, and the triangulation. So there's often a man sort of standing there as the third term, and you allude to Anne Carson and Sappho's reading of Sappho, where like the woman speaking to a man and the other woman is watching. There's always like a jealousy vector going on, and so you draw out those elements of Akerman.
Yeah, exactly. So the chapter on desire is really about triangles and not just the couple. Maybe that's one way to think about the difference between the two. Because I'm bringing Anne Carson into the picture, and Anne Carson basically suggested that the desire has a sort of structure where it tries to maintain itself by inserting obstacles. And so there has to be like a third element in order to keep it alive, to keep the desire alive. And I was thinking that that is like that triangulation is something you see in her road movies in various ways. Like sometimes it's a person, but sometimes it's the romance plot, as I said. There might be other things that are kind of like functioning as obstacles to the fulfillment of desire.
Right. It's like in love, the third term is not a man, but like the third presence of the plot that the man and the woman are supposed to be enacting.
Yeah.
That kind of becomes party to the relationship. There was a cool part where you describe, I can't remember, where two women are kissing two men and they like look at each other during it, and the kissing is very short, but they spend a really long time talking about it afterwards. So it's more about their relation to each other rather than like the men are kind of a prop for their relationship, you know? So that was an interesting moment. Let's have another question. Let's see. We're doing pretty well on time. We have time for several more questions.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the book. And I'm curious, since you've already brought him up, if you might say a little bit more about Cavell and how you were inspired by him. I think you turned to him in really interesting ways in your book, whether to talk about the documentary form in Akerman's work and the idea of like the world unseen and this fantasy that Cavell talks about, or like genre. You also turned to Cavell to think about sort of genre as a way of like talking at a tradition, and maybe how you see yourself in a way like talking at Cavell, or the way he has developed a certain tradition of writing about film and philosophy and maybe pioneered it in a certain way. Yeah, if you just had sort of any thoughts about that, I'd be very curious to hear. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I don't know if I have much to say as far as the meta question goes about how I'm sort of enacting that in my relationship with Cavell, but there were specific aspects of Cavell's work that were really generative for me, and you mentioned too. So in the chapter on documentaries, I was engaging with Cavell's comments that sometimes a documentarian feels so guilty that they feel the need to insert themselves into the picture by filming the camera. And that this was, and he was very critical of this move because he actually thought that this was a certain way of not being open to what it is that you're filming, because you feel like you need to sort of situate yourself with respect to it in advance. And I was trying to suggest that this is one way in which Akerman is sort of disagreeing with Cavell, despite the fact that she was very worried about this lack of receptivity or this being overly guided by preconceptions. But she does insert herself into her documentaries in various ways, and I was suggesting that this actually facilitated a disclosure of her subject matter and wasn't meant to be a kind of guilty confession. And so I thought that was a really fruitful way of bringing out what's original about Akerman's own self-reference in her documentaries by bringing it into conversation with Cavell. Cavell's work on genre is obviously fascinating, partly because he's got this completely different interpretation of what a genre is, where it's not defined by these characteristics that a number of films share, but it sort of becomes increasingly self-aware because it's always a kind of reflection on the tradition that you are becoming a member of. And I guess I was suggesting that that is one way of thinking about Akerman's films, because there is something highly self-reflective about her genre films, very often partly because they flout these conventions or because she's pushing up against their limits. And so this is one way in which she's kind of reflecting on the inheritance. And in that respect, I do think that she was kind of exhibiting Cavell's own conception of how genres unfold or develop across time rather than disagreeing with Cavell. I think as far as my own relationship with Cavell goes, I do think that he's such an incredible, he's so incredibly insightful in the films that he writes. But I guess I did feel that at times he wasn't as focused on the visual aspects of the films, and that maybe he wasn't giving the kind of close readings of scenes that I would have liked. And so maybe this is one way in which I'm trying to go a little bit against Cavell's own approach. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense because, I mean, there are ways in which Cavell kind of started something that you're following more so than you're following the other books in this particular series, which is about film and philosophy and has, a series of books about different directors by philosophers.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're pushing it in a different direction, more connected to the world of film criticism and film studies. There's a moment where you talk about Cavell's pursuits of happiness, and Wittgenstein makes a cameo appearance. You say that Cavell's definition of genre, in his definition of genre, a genre is the inheritance of certain conditions, procedures, subjects, and goals. A film would then be the member of a genre if it studies this inheritance and assumes responsibility for it. He invokes Wittgenstein's metaphor of family resemblances in order to spell this out. As the metaphor suggests, we can identify certain films as belonging to the same genre because they resemble one another, even if we cannot draw up a list of properties that they all share, which is basically what you just said. And that his point is not just that the members of a genre look like each other, but that they look at each other for, quote, they are what they are in view of one another. That was like a cool moment of Cavell to kind of help us think through genre as resemblance, as kind of almost like an echo chamber of form or something. So just for people who maybe didn't, know what you said about Cavell, that's an example. Other questions?
Yeah.
This is kind of a selfish question, but my own like undisciplined relationship to Akerman is the pleasure that is drawn from kind of sometimes like her films take a lot out of you, and a lot of times because they are both like very enthralling and very boring. And so I was just kind of I was interested if in the book you explore this dimension of duration that is involved in an encounter with an Akerman film, and how that might be routed through the other 4 keywords. I think she has like this very funny, in one interview she says something very funny about like people who come to see her films, like they should feel like their time is like, they should feel like they have given up time that they would never get back, right? Like so I like to sort of and I find that actually like impossibly like attractive, and like the hostility of it all. So I was just curious, like if in the book you talk about this question of temporality in relation to like an encounter with an Akerman film.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely central, obviously, because her films are on the slow and long side. But you're right. I mean, she actually makes a statement again and again. It's one of her favorite things to say about her own films is that, people go to the movies and say, I didn't even notice the time pass. I didn't even notice that 2 hours went by. And she's like, in my films, you notice the time pass. And I think one of the things that she was also interested there is that people feel very anxious when they notice the time pass. And she thought that one of the reasons for it is that it makes them aware of their own mortality, because you feel like you're like rushing towards the end. And so I think that's sort of connected for her with these moods that she's trying to put you in terms of like, not feeling at ease or not feeling settled. So it was central to the book, but I think I also think that a lot of her films deal with time very differently, because she also has a lot of fast-paced movies. She also has a lot of short movies. So in some ways, like she's kind of all over the place as far as the tempo and the duration of her films themselves go. And I think these are just different ways in which she was investigating that experience of sitting through her films. I would say about Jeanne Dielman in particular, though, that even though that is always taken to be the paradigmatic film that induces boredom, I actually feel like it is a very fast-paced and action-packed film because it completely retrains your attention. And as you're watching it, you start to jump at the slightest variation. Like she drops her spoon and suddenly like, you jump up in your seat. And I think this is one way in which the film kind of makes you the viewer that it's trying to invite. And so I don't actually think, I think there's other films she makes which are much harder to sit through. Like Almayer's Folly is a very challenging film. I don't write about it in the book. It's her last fiction film. It's incredibly slow. It's a Conrad adaptation. So I think she made some that really go there. But I think for me, Jeanne Dielman is still a film that has like a kind of, it's kind of busy and teeming in a way that is somewhat different. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you talk a lot about the quality of attention. I think that question of attention in relation to your question about sort of immersion, fascination, time, boredom, whatever it is, that all those things have to do with kind of reconstructing attention in a way that you show in the book.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other thoughts, questions, responses?
Hey, Andrea. This is just a personal question. You mentioned that, I can't tell. You mentioned that you watched Akerman for the first time when you were in grad school. I'm just kind of wondering, how long have you been thinking about writing a book like this? Is it like something that you came to after writing books on Hegel and thinking like, now I want to take a break and I want to do something else? Or did you know when you first watched Akerman that you would want to come back to this at some point?
I definitely did not know that at the time. So I watched Akerman in Film Forum in New York. At the time, I didn't know that I wanted to write about her or film in general. I always loved film, but I never considered writing about it. I have a friend who does, and that was part of what inspired me to do it. But I think it was also teaching Akerman. So I teach a course that's called Existentialism in Literature and Film, and I was teaching Jeanne Dielman in that context. And I found the students' reaction to the film really inspiring. So they had very positive responses and found a lot that resonated with them in the film, and it made me more intrigued by her. And also in preparing for teaching the film in that context, I delved a little bit more into her work, her body of work, and I realized just how much she's made. I mean, she made over 40 films. And then she also wrote a few texts, and she made installations, so she was incredibly prolific. And it made me sort of want to take a closer look at her. But I guess I would say that I started thinking about her, about writing this book in like 2021. So it hasn't been that long. And then it was just a very immersive experience to actually work on her, because then I also started reading all the film scholarship and really anything I could get my hands on about Akerman and try to incorporate it in some way. Thank you.
Yeah, you use a lot of, like, I don't know if you know, like there's the podcast, The Akerman Year, where people listen to, like, watch all the Akerman and talk about it, and you draw that in, and you draw in, Sandy Flitterman Lewis's book, which is a whole book about Akerman, or Ivan Margulies's book called Nothing Happens about Akerman. You draw on those, but also like an essay by Kaja Silverman. And, there's so many people that I didn't realize had touched on Akerman, but they had written about, like, somehow Je tu Hillel was irresistible for so many people. So it's really interesting to get like little bits and pieces of the voices of many different critics who somehow couldn't resist Akerman as a kind of catalyst for a thought about many different topics. You also bring in Simone de Beauvoir in your writing about housework. There's a really, like, that caught me, the kind of, so you bring in sort of very explicit, like, feminist, work for, what's it called? Work for wages campaign, where
Wages for housework.
Wages for housework campaign. So very explicit kind of strong feminist, political, direct statements, but then also, and critiques of just housework is utterly futile, it's pointless, it's repetitive, it's boring. But then in other moments, there's a lot of ambivalence around, like, the tactility of, you describe, Jeanne Dielman putting the veal cutlet into the breading, and there's something kind of beautiful and intense and tactile and pleasurable about I don't know, that goopy piece of meat. And so, that would sort of undermine the idea that housework is just purely a drudge. So you bring in some really interesting kind of ambivalences, which I don't think get resolved. You hold those open in the book.
Yeah. But I really was trying to find anything anyone has said on Akerman. Like, for example, Kate Zambrino. Like, she's also a contemporary writer who occasionally makes comments about Akerman. I try to incorporate those as well. So I was really trying to make it a kind of synthesis of everything I could find on Akerman. And then anything that I found illuminating as a source of inspiration or as a potential interlocutor for her as well, whether or not they'd written about her.
Yeah, but it's interesting because we're at our last minute here, but it's really interesting because you do quote Akerman in the main body of the text, but not very often, or not too many of these sources are like in a normal scholarly book, you like put big chunk quotes of all the people who have ever said anything, and you kind of take all those and you stick them in the footnotes. So that it actually is very like a smooth read, very kind of fun to read. And if you want to know about the other 600 people who have written something about Akerman, you can, and I did, go back and forth to the footnotes that are conveniently located at the end of each chapter rather than at the end of the book. So obviously people are intended to like download one chapter with its notes. So there's an interesting kind of formal choice that you make to have all those voices there, but at the same time to foreground Akerman's own quotes and your descriptions of the scenes and kind of the more central thing. Anyway, let's thank Andreja for